So good afternoon, everybody. It is really a great pleasure and a privilege for me to be speaking here today. Before I start, I would like to deeply thank the University of Auckland for this invitation and opportunity, and especially Stephanie Honey and my good friend Mia, who made sure that my stay in New Zealand is a wonderful, immersive experience. We are seeing strong mutations in today's world. Mutations driven by digitalization and artificial intelligence, we just talked about that, by powerful social and political shifts, by climate change, and by health pandemics. There is, however, one thing that remained constant in this world: gender inequalities. According to the United Nations, it will take more than 200 years to remove discriminatory laws against women. I realize that I'm painting a very gloomy picture, but positive change can happen. And the most strategic trend that would or should be shaping our world for the better is gender equality. Why? Because women are agents of positive change. They are at the core of economies, societies, communities, families, and history making, because they are at the core of multilateral issues and the many current global crises, because gender equality is central to finding solutions to our global problems. But we need to look at women beyond the traditional and very simplistic categorization, putting them into three boxes: workers, entrepreneurs, or consumers. Women are more than that. They are entrepreneurs and job creators. They are innovators, drivers of economic diversification, climate change mitigators, healthcare givers and workers, agents of food security, peace builders and leaders. And in these different roles, they strengthen communities and economies. Women are also traders. And it is undeniable that trade plays a significant role in promoting gender equality. This year, the WTO is celebrating its 30th anniversary, and for most of its life, until 2016, the organization's narrative on gender equality was very strong. Gender is not a trade issue, and it is not part of the WTO mandate. It is a human rights issue that belongs to the United Nations. The main argument backing this narrative was to say that the rules of international trade, negotiated and adopted at the WTO by governments, were totally gender neutral. It is true that in the 600 pages of the WTO rulebook, the terms gender, gender equality, women or men are not mentioned. But it doesn't mean that these rules apply equally to men and women. Actually, they don't, because women face higher barriers than men in accessing the economic opportunities created by trade. Higher barriers, often founded on negative social norms and traditions, keeping women without resources, education, or security. In 2024, the World Bank revealed that women have just 2/3 of the right of men in the workplace. It also outlined that nowhere in the world do women have the same legal rights as men, including in relations with safety, entrepreneurship, mobility, workplace, pay, marriage, parenthood, childcare, assets, and pensions. Key areas such as labor market regulations, affordable and quality childcare, entrepreneurship support, and women's safety at work lag really behind. In 2024, the Social Institutions and Gender Indexed Regional Report for Southeast Asia, drafted by the OECD, scores that despite wide variation between countries, the vast majority of the region's women, which is about 340 million, continue to live in countries where discrimination is assessed high or very high. Evidence from the World Bank showed that when female traders cross the border between Laos PDR and Cambodia, they pay higher taxes, are delayed longer by quarantine, and spend more on transportation to pass through the border than their male counterparts. So why is it so important to eliminate these barriers for women? Well, this is the simplest math problem of the century. Women constitute an economic force, and the more they're involved, the more economies grow. Women contribute to 37% of the global GDP. Increasing women's participation in the labor market to the same level as men's could raise countries' GDP to 34%. In the Asia-Pacific region, advancing gender equality could add $3.5 trillion to their collective annual GDP by 2025, which is tomorrow. In New Zealand, if women entrepreneurs were able to secure investment at the same rate as men, it would represent a $32 billion opportunity for economic growth. So it's therefore very indisputable that women are growth and poverty reduction actors. Trade has the power to change women's life for the better. I'm convinced of this. But it only works if trade policies integrate gender equality issues to level the trading playing field for women, which is currently very much unbalanced. In fact, this is an ongoing trade policy trend. In the last decade, countries around the world have progressively integrated gender issues in their trade policies, either through free trade agreements, bilateral and regional, their national trade policies, or aid for trade programs. Governments have been designing gender-responsive trade policies that promote women's employment to support their economic growth, or fill a workforce shortage in export-oriented sectors or sectors lacking foreign investment. Many governments include women's economic empowerment and their integration in the job market as a key priority in their national trade and investment strategies. They are supporting women's entry into the export workforce through skills development, for example, or by providing financial incentives to companies to employ women. When it comes to supporting women, trade policy also and mostly target women entrepreneurs and female farmers. Building their trade capacity through specialized trainings, giving them access to finance at advantageous conditions, and establishing quotas to enter government procurement markets, among others. In fact, today, we see three important shifts happening in trade policy making. First, and for a while, governments were only seeing one side of the trade and gender coin, the one that showed that trade works for women's empowerment by creating opportunities for them, economic opportunities. Now, many governments have flipped the coin, and they estimate that gender equality is also directly supporting their trade expansion and their integration in international markets, even linking female leadership in trade to export growth. They believe that gender issues should be an integral part of their trade policies and strategies, and that investing in women's productive potential is essential to enhancing their trade performance. Since 2019, supporting this trend, and with the aim of promoting gender-responsive trade policymaking, the WTO developed a training program for government officials to build their capacity in integrating gender issues across the trade policy spectrum, and has developed a set of policy tools on trade and gender for this purpose. Next year, we are going to extend our training program regionally to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Also, with the same objective, in May 2021, the WTO launched the WTO Gender Research Hub, a network of 45 trade and gender researchers from academia and international organizations. The hub is now recognized as a major global platform where most of the new innovative and groundbreaking research on trade and gender is being conducted. One of the hub's goals is to connect researchers and policymakers as they can mutually support each other's work on gender. Following this purpose, in December 2022, the WTO organized the World Trade Congress on Gender, the first international research conference on trade and gender, and in November 2023, the Youth Trade Summit on Gender to build the next generation on trade, to build the next generation of trade and gender experts. Stemming from this summit in July, we launched the WTO Youth Talent Incubator Program to shape future leaders in trade and gender. A second shift is also happening, this one inside the WTO. Until 8 years ago, the simple idea of talking about trade and gender equality in the WTO was considered impossible, even a joke. Now the topic is part of the WTO's work program, and I believe it is shaping the WTO's reform even more than any other topics. Since 2016, the WTO has evolved from a gender-blind organization to a gender-responsive one. With the creation of the Informal Working Group on Trade and Gender in 2020, which includes 130 WTO members, we have institutionalized the issue in the organization to a point that, for the first time, we are now working on the basis of a ministerial mandate adopted by consensus by all members at the 30th Ministerial Conference in February this year, and contained in paragraph 16 of the Abu Dhabi Ministerial Declaration. With this dedicated paragraph, not only have all WTO members recognized the links between trade, gender, and sustainable development for the first time, but they also considered they also confirmed the mainstreaming objective of the working group and recognized the work of the WTO on the matter. I really would like to emphasize this point, as it has unfortunately remained unnoticed, while it is a very historic milestone for the WTO. With the institutionalization of gender in the WTO, and given the cross-cutting nature of the issue, WTO members are starting to talk about social issues, which were and are still considered to be outside of the WTO mandate. And this is the third shift. Governments are starting to realize that their gender-responsive trade policies are less impactful if they are not accompanied by social policies, addressing gender bias and negative social norms that are still very vivid in many countries, even in the most developed ones. Data is telling us that exporting firms employ more women than those focusing on domestic markets, that firms involved in global value chains hire more women than those which are not. But it's not about the quantity, it is also the quality of these jobs. Unfortunately, most of them are low-level, low-skilled, low-paid jobs, leaving managerial and leadership positions to men. About 80% of the female workforce in firms that export hold medium and low-skilled jobs. For this reason, some governments use their trade policies to balance the scale in favor of women by improving their working conditions in export sectors, addressing wage discrimination, mobility issues, and sometimes even gender-based violence in trade-related sectors. To the extent that a few countries, such as Pakistan, have actually integrated these social issues into their trade policies, while the common practice is to adopt social policies in parallel to trade policies to complement them. In the end, it is clear that economic empowerment and social empowerment are two sides of the same coin when it comes to trade and gender, and social issues need to be embedded in trade policies if we want them to work for women. Trade rules and WTO agreements can also work for women. They can if they are implemented with a gender perspective. And in fact, the flexibilities and the policy space in WTO agreements can very well support women's economic empowerment. Take the WTO agreement on agriculture. It allows developing countries to provide input subsidies to their low-income and poor farmers. Evidence shows that female farmers actually lack access to productive resources, often because they lack the capital to buy them. And according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, if women had access to productive resources at the same level as men's, they would increase the production by 20 to 30%. Therefore, this provision could work for female farmers who precisely lack support in accessing such resources. And guess what? It works. In 2016, the Gambia donated bags of fertilizers to women on a very limited scale and in response to an emergency situation. This example shows that WTO rules could be translated into national policies for the benefit of women, depending on the country's need at the national level. I would like also to take the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. It can support women entrepreneurs in accessing global markets. This agreement contains, and I'm going to be a bit technical here, the de minimis provision, which is actually grounded in the reality of women entrepreneurs, as they tend to run smaller businesses as compared to male entrepreneurs. In fact, these provisions allow governments to establish a minimum value under which custom duties and taxes are not collected. So this provision could be useful for women entrepreneurs engaged in exports, who are often trading small parcels, given the nature of their businesses. Many women, many women entrepreneurs dominate the garment and handicraft sector and often deal with small value exports. Also, many women entrepreneurs, while formally established, trade informally. This is what we call the suitcase trade or the suitcase export. They export small amounts of their goods to their networks abroad, often families or friends, which sell their products for them. And lastly, women entrepreneurs mostly own or lead micro businesses. And if they are supplying to the global market, they don't provide large amounts of products. So therefore, not applying taxes and duties to exported goods could be an advantage for women. Actually, with Professor Amrita Berry from the University ITAM of Mexico, we are currently working on a book analyzing how international trade law supports gender equality and women's economic empowerment, with the objective to release it possibly in 2026. When it comes to gender equality in trade, many talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. And at WTO, we do talk, but we also take action by initiating innovative and inclusive projects. The WTO is partnering with about 20 different parties, such as international organizations, the civil society at large, academia, and governmental groups, including the G20, APEC, and ASEAN, with the objective to implement various projects ranging from technical assistance and capacity building, sex disaggregated data collection in trade, to legal and economic research and investment initiatives. Future collaborative plans include the creation of the WTO Trade and Gender Academy, a dedicated leadership and trade program for women entrepreneurs, entitled Bridge, and the establishment of the Development Forum on Trade and Gender Equality, a WTO NGO exchange platform on gender equality and social issues. One could think that the WTO is big enough to do it on its own, but these partnerships strengthen the organization's capacity to deliver on its objectives and projects. It's really as simple as that. Doing it alone would mean taking twice the risk, the time, the resources, and efforts to potentially achieve some results with minimal impact. And impact comes from actions. I've spoken about our mutating world and crises that are shaping it. Whether financial, climate, or health-related crises, they are not gender neutral. Our current world is treating women worse than men because no matter the crisis, they are impacting women the most. Something that needs to be taken into consideration when designing trade policies, as I believe that trade can support women in crafting a way out of this crisis. All these changes also mean that we need leaders to be more resilient in their actions and work for a long-term impact. It also means that we need more women at the decision-making tables. People often mistakenly associate leadership with influence and power. I think it's something else. I believe that leadership is about empowering people to take charge and make change in their communities. It is about transforming societies. I truly believe in the power of women to play that key transformative role, bringing and leading communities out of poverty, and trade can help them in this role. Bringing more women in decision-making positions in the public and private sectors has been a key focus for the WTO in the past year, working with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women on this topic. And there is a link to trade policy. In fact, some free trade agreements include provisions that focus on female leadership and women's participation in decision-making. They support or promote women's high-level positions in society and their contribution to decision-making in business or in the public sphere. They include commitments to develop female leadership through training and experience sharing, to foster female leadership networks in business and trade, and to promote equal participation of men and women in decision-making positions. The question is why countries have gone ahead to include such provisions in trade agreements if they are not really directly impacting women's access to opportunities created by trade. In fact, evidence shows that when women lead companies, they are more efficient. Firms with female chief technology officers are more innovative than those with male CTOs. Similarly, governments run by women can be more efficient. A 2021 study demonstrated that countries led by women were better prepared and faced a lower level of death rates due to COVID-19 than countries run by men because female political leaders had invested more in their country's universal healthcare. At the WTO, the figures on female leadership speak for themselves. Only 30% of WTO ambassadors are female, and 16% of ministers in charge of trade are women. Therefore, despite the exponential progress made in just 8 years, growing from a one-woman operation to a ministerial mandate, the WTO has still a long road ahead. But making trade work for women is what we have and are engaged to do. And we will continue towards this goal because it makes sense economically, socially, and politically. Thank you.
Well, kia ora, and thank you very much for that very whirlwind tour of the work of the WTO and in the gender space. And just want to acknowledge the focus on gender responsiveness and recognising, I would say, that when we talk about gender, it's a relational construct. So doing gender analysis or being gender responsive can also be valuable to a whole raft of communities and groups of men as well if they are disadvantaged or underrepresented in areas. So we tend to use it as a mechanism and a tool or a mechanism in which to build some tools that will enable men and women, and a focus on gender allows for LGBTQIA+ groups as well. So thinking intersectionality here, not an easy term to operationalise in policy and probably in trade, but nevertheless still a really important space to be working in. So I wondered if so my team, our team at the PPI, we've been working on gender responsive budgeting here in New Zealand since 2018. We were able to get it up with in conjunction with the Ministry for Women and Treasury for 2 years, and now it's disappeared again. So we had a pilot, and then we had the full suite last year. We were like, yep. And then, but I think one thing that we've learned through that process is there's still a lot of soft power work that needs to be done. So we've done a lot of work on the Bringing Gender In tool, which is an online tool to help public servants do gender analysis work across the policy spectrum. So in foreign policy and trade, if those that are working in those agencies view it as a non-gender neutral subject. And those are the conversations I think we found in our engagement with some of the agencies, which was, oh, can we talk to you about gender responsiveness and climate change? And they're like, oh, no, that's gender neutral. And we're like, yeah, no, it's not. So I wondered what sort of work the WTO is imagining in that space of in that soft power space of encouraging, the suits in the room, the dark blue suits, not the lovely lime green suits, in the room to recognise this as something they may need to educate themselves about, to progress it, to do leadership on it as supportive leaders in the room of CEDAW and the tools that come out of that.
Well, actually, we have this training program that we have put into place since 2019, which really looks at how to integrate gender into trade policy. So it's really practical. We have developed a set of different policy tools to support governments into integrating these issues. And with this training, we also are able to bring more awareness about these issues and the links between trade and gender, because it's still not an automatic thinking that there is a link there. And it's not just men, actually, some women as well. We had the last session we did this year, we had a woman from Botswana, and she said, the first thing she said, first day, first hour, I'm not convinced about trade and gender. So that was great. And so in the end, she concluded the training and she said, now I get it. So which is quite important, for us to also change the mindset. So there is that aspect which is quite important, because during these trainings we are face to face with government officials from all levels. So we try to select as a different spectrum of representatives, and also from all ministries. We don't just focus on trade ministries. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is research. And our research focused mostly on trade policy, actually, on gender-responsive trade policy, and the legal aspect of trade and gender, because there is a lot of economic work being done, and far less in terms of policy. And when I talk about policy, often people talk about trade policy and they refer to free trade agreements. Well, actually, it's not just free trade agreements, it's also national trade policies. And this is where the core of the business is at the national level, because this is where you can translate your very general gender provisions or gender commitments in your FTAs into specific measures. So in FTAs, you have the what, and then in national trade policies, you have the how. Mm-hmm. So, and this is where you can really kind of target your measures to really support women. And so we are looking at, of course, FTAs, national trade policies, and aid for trade programs. I think it's a very important instrument, very powerful instrument to also integrate gender into this trade policy. So we do a lot of research on that. We have now created a couple of databases that looks at, kind of compiling the gender provisions in free trade agreements, compiling measures on having access to the measures allowing women to have access to finance as well. And we are now working on a database which is integrating and mapping all these different measures and capturing these measures, looking at the full spectrum of trade policy, that is to say, free trade agreements, national policies, and aid for trade. So with that, it also helps us to build a new narrative. Mm-hmm. That's the idea also, because when I first started this work 8 years ago, I was just by myself. And people were not convinced at all. People are still not convinced in the organization. Outside of the organization, that's a different ball game. But inside the organization, I'm not talking about members. I'm talking about the secretariat, my own colleagues. Often they don't really believe that it's an important issue, or it's a technical issue. It's just a soft issue, and it's just, we talk about female leadership and we tick the box and that's fine. Well, actually it's quite technical. And often they see that it's just this cherry on the cake, it's nice, it's very decorative, but if you take the cherry out of the cake, it doesn't really change the taste of the cake. So in the end, it's not that important. Whereas you have governments that are saying, the members, and we have 130 members that are saying, well, it's important to us, and it has an economic value, it has an economic impact. So we are working within this context, and as to a very long answer to say that we are also using our work to change this narrative, which we have been slowly seeing a little bit of change, but it's not where I want it to be.
Kia ora, thank you. So I'm going to open it up for questions. Jimena.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon. Thank you for such an interesting speech. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit more about how to raise the attention to the topic, because in the developing world, women have so many needs, and they seem always more pressing needs. We have domestic violence, we have the care system that needs to be developed in order to allow women to go to work or go to do businesses. And in the other side, in the trade area, always seems more, the policy officers seem more interested in increasing trade, increasing exports. So it's not a priority for trade. It's not a priority for the women policy. Even like you mentioned, even for feminists, it's not a priority. So, but I do believe, like yourself, that it's something that we should do better. So how can we raise the attention to this topic in the developing world, that everything seems more important than trade and women? Thank you for your help.
Am I taking another one before I ask Anoush to answer? Steph.
Thank you. Thank you, Anoush. That was amazing. If I may, I'll sneak in 2 questions, but you can disregard at least one of them. Relatedly, do you think the focus on trade and gender, or gender as an issue, is a sort of a luxury that will become unaffordable in the very disrupted, next few years we I guess, can anticipate in light of all the doom from this morning? And my second question is a sort of more of a practical one. You, with your, encyclopedic oversight of all of the research in the Trade and Gender Hub, what actually works? Because in the APEX space, we have these, we've for years and years been talking about women's economic empowerment and all these things that we need to do. But I think my impression, at least, is that there's not a lot of good data about the things that actually make a difference. Is it something to do with finance, or is it more women-led trade missions, or, what is it? Have you seen anything in the research that you're bringing together that shows, okay, well, if we just poured our effort into women's access to venture capital funding or whatever it is, that would make a difference? And is it the same across all economies? Thanks.
Hello, my name is Kemi. So my question is this. We see in recent time there've been this shift from the concept of gender to inclusiveness. So talking about the intersectional lens, we know that the way a male or a man or woman would experience policy might be different. So it's not enough to just base it on those differences. There are also other intersecting factors that we need to consider, factors such as ethnicity, race, culture. So just want to know, what is the WTO's position on incorporating inclusiveness or inclusivity into, is this something that is going on in the WTO, rather than just, because when people hear the word gender, the mindset is just that it's all about women. So what's the position of the WTO on this? Thank you.
Is that? Well, thank you for these questions. I'll answer the last question first. Yes, it's all about women. So, in the WTO, it's all about women. So, as you know, we are member-driven organization, and when we started to work on these issues, the word gender was sort of banned from any sort of document that we were going to release, because for some countries, gender means also other things. Sexual orientation and all these other issues that also you've mentioned. And for them, it's a red flag. So instead of trying to define what gender means for WTO, we said we're going to talk about women economic empowerment. So that was, until now, until recently, that was basically what it is. Now we talk about trade and gender because it is understood that we're only talking about women in the WTO. So we can talk about trade and gender. But it doesn't mean that these issues are real and that we should ignore them. And actually, now we're getting to a point that I would like to take things a little bit further than just talking about women and to look at these specific issues. So at the public forum this year, so the public forum, for those who don't know, it's this big annual outreach event of the WTO when we talk about trade in general, but also from different perspectives, and it can be also very provocative. We can have, we can be a bit more provocative during the public forum, it's allowed. And so basically we organized a panel which looking at the 5 pillars of inclusive trade. And so we talked about women, we talked about youth, we talked about indigenous people, we talked about LGBTQ+, and we talked about people with disability, with this inclusive trade perspective. So, and now we're kind of using that panel to say, okay, well, maybe we should go deeper into this issue. And there are research going on these different topics that are quite pioneer and quite groundbreaking. So we decided to sort of come up with a publication on that. And also to sort of define the concept of inclusive trade, because we've been talking about inclusive trade for a long time, but for some it's about it's about least developed countries and their access to the trading system. For others, it's all about women. So what does it mean exactly, and how can, on that basis, use this work to then integrate these issues into policy. So the idea would be also to have a more practical outcome of that. But in terms of the discussion in the WTO right now, we don't talk about these issues. So it's all about women. Your question you mentioned, and I think it relates to Stephanie's second question. It's data. You just need the data. You just need the data. It's easy to say.
Data that we don't have.
Data that you don't have. So you need to create that data. You need to get that data. And in order to do that, and it's not so that complicated. Often, we talking with governments like, but I don't have anything. I don't know, and my statisticians, they're not trained to do this work, and I don't have the resources. Actually, if you look more closely to the collection, the data that governments are collecting, you could very well see that you have already some existing data. You're just not exploiting it. So the first step in order to get that data is to do your own internal data collection, understanding who is collecting what, and on that basis, understanding is there a gender component to this data collection, and if not, then integrate it. So it could be as simple as that, understanding what you already have, and then push it a little bit to the next level. Of course, collecting data can take a lot of time, but it can be just also a simple survey that you conduct at the national level. And I'm saying it could be just a simple survey. It's not that simple, because then you need to have, in addition to doing this data collection, you need to have these relations established with your external stakeholders as a government. So you need to have access to women entrepreneurs associations, for example, or NGOs that are working on women's rights, and so on and so forth. You need to integrate those organizations within your trade policy consultations, for example. But in order to do that, you need to know them. And often you don't know them because often entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, are not that organized. It depends on different regions. I'll just give you two examples. So in South Asia, women entrepreneurs are super organized. They have, each of them, they have national organizations, sometimes two different, and then you have a regional umbrella organization, and they are very active, and what they do at the regional level sprinkle down to the national level, to the national federations. Recently, they're partners with the UN SCAP to develop this training course on e-commerce for women entrepreneurs in the region. So they've been pretty active and very well organized. If you take the region of East Africa, you have a plethora of organizations. And it's very interesting because many of those are not just integrating formal entrepreneurs, but also informal entrepreneurs. So it's kind of an interesting uniqueness in these organizations. But they're not organized. They don't talk to each other. And in the end, they're lacking the weight to go and talk to governments, or they are lacking the weight to be able to be recognized by the government as being an important stakeholder in terms of the trade policy aspect or the data collection aspect. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done within the government itself already. And here we talk about intergovernmental collaboration, which is a very difficult thing in every country. Whether least developed countries, it's always been a very difficult issue for ministries to talk to each other or government officials to talk to each other. I don't know why is that. Maybe it's part of the culture being a government, but we've seen that a lot. And especially when it comes to gender, it's very important because gender is cross-cutting. So if you have an issue which is cross-cutting, you can't talk about trade without talking about agriculture. You can't talk about agriculture without talking about technical barriers to trade. You can't talk about that if you're not addressing issues related to gender-based violence, because gender-based violence prevents women from having access to economic opportunities, obviously makes it more difficult. You also have gender-based violence, as I was saying, for workers in the field. So a lot of these issues are very much horizontal and needs to be addressed because trade can support that. You were talking about the most important issue is the social aspect, the gender-based violence and human rights. The trade aspect is less important. Well, it's important because, and this is the second part of the question, the answer is that it's just about, in the end, to convince, it's just about economic efficiency. That's the key. If you don't realize, and I think more and more governments, the ways I've seen things evolve in the last, I would say, 10 years about that, is that before government would say, yeah, but it's not. Now government are saying, yes, we need to do that. We need to integrate women into trade. We need to integrate women into the economy because it strengthens our economy. It allows us to grow. And it has a ripple effect on poverty reduction because women reinvest. We have women entrepreneurs. We've conducted a survey with women entrepreneurs in 2019 and 2020. And one question was, okay, what do you do with the income you get, whether it's from trade or not from trade? Of course, they're invested in the company. But then they said to us, well, we're doing all the other things and we are reinvesting in our community, which is quite interesting. So they're building their communities, and also entrepreneurs are saying, well, I've created my company because I want to create more jobs for other women. So you have that sort of effect, a positive effect that could also, that is being really documented and seen and being acknowledged by governments. So there is that, we're talking about narratives, but that narrative has changed a little bit and saying that, okay, then we need to do something about it. Then you have the trade ministries that, scratch their heads like, oh, how do I do that? Often, it's been 8 years now, I've got officials coming and say, but how do I do that? How do I integrate gender into these policies and into the work that we do? So, and this is where the training comes I believe, quite handy for them, but that's just my opinion. So you have a combination of actions that needs to be really, or you need to kind of lay the foundations for it. And then it's like, building a house. You lay the foundations and then you can build your house. You can, to a point that you start to, okay, now I can decorate my house. But you need to start from the ground. Again, data collection and understanding within the government what's happening, and also having this trusted relationship with your key stakeholders to support your work.
Can I come back to Steph's negative question? Sorry, Steph. But actually it was a question from Mia as well about the prospective havoc that may come with tariff changes and so on. Does this cherry on the top idea that you argued that it's not that, it's much more substantial, it's probably about the flour or the eggs or something, if we're using that as a metaphor. But we know from the Trump campaign that topics around women and gender are not so well thought of. So what do you think that means for all the efforts that the WTO and other organisations and GTAG and there's just so many initiatives that we've seen happen in the last 8 to 10 years. So what's your take on the future? And we've got 6 minutes. And we've got a question up the back as well. Yes. So keep this one short, and then I'll go to Tani.
It's very difficult. It's just almost impossible to know. And it's very difficult for me to be able to comment on what a government would do or not in my position. But I can tell you this. Looking at how the US was involved in these issues, even when Trump was in power, actually the US was outside of these discussions for a while. Not because they couldn't care less about it, it's just because they didn't know how to handle it. They didn't have their own narrative on the issue. So given that they didn't have their own narrative or their own thinking or their own, approach to the issue, they said, we're not going to get involved. They started to get involved only as of 2022. And even then, they decided to be part of the working group, but even then with a very sort of observer approach kind of thing. So I think that it's not a key priority for the US in the sense that in terms of a political position, taking a stand in the organization. And you have other countries that are much more against the issue in the WTO than the US, which have said, well, gender is not a trade issue. But then they have not been vocal about it. So it's quite interesting because it's also about PR as a government. And if you're saying you're against women, it doesn't really look good, right? So you don't really say you are against women. You just don't participate. And of course, there have some red lines. And here in the WTO, we're not talking about negotiating rules on trade and gender. This is not at all the objective of the work that we do. The work that we do is focused on policy making and gender-responsive policy making, which is something very different. And these countries that are saying that gender is not a trade issue are afraid that, some countries we're going to come up with a new rule and it's going to be like looking at it like environment, saying that it's this guy's protectionism. Well, it seems that we don't need to have disguised protectionism, because potentially we'll have full-on protectionism in the coming year also. But it's kind of the argument that was circulating among these group of countries that are not really supporting the issue, but they are not supporting the issue vocally or by action as well, saying that, oh, we shouldn't be talking about that. The Secretariat should not be working on this. Why are you devoting these resources to this issue? We should be devoting these experts to something else. Nothing happened in that field, and we're going to continue. I think we'll be able to continue our work. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer and Anoush. Hopefully a quick question, mindful of the time. It was lovely meeting you earlier in the year at the public forum, and welcome. And thank you also for your presentation. You could easily insert the topic that I practice in, Indigenous trade, throughout your presentation and the similarities. And the data that you presented, the arguments that you presented are easily understandable. Yes, that makes economic sense to me for why we should enhance trade and gender, trade and Indigenous, and so on. Yet the barriers remain. You've been at this for 8 years within the WTO. How do you keep or continue to explain in new ways, or having to come up with new explanations or new rationale, the same principles and why it matters?
Well, and this is also something which I think it also relates to what Stephanie was asking. It's about showing it, showing how it works, really. And the only downside to that is that it can be very anecdotal, and you can be accused of saying, oh, well, the case is just for, I don't know, Latin America, or just for Chile or Peru or whatever. But you can see that across the board it has some effect, some positive effect. So the thing is, with all these different policies, they're quite new. So to have an impact right away is quite difficult to see. So when we have the issue about the lack of data, in terms of, at the very beginning, you need data to be able to inform your policy. At the sort of end of the policy implementation, it's difficult to really analyze the impact of what you're doing, because you don't have enough long-term implementation to be able to know how it works. Only now we have a country like Chile, who is, I think, one of the biggest gender champion in the world in terms of trade. I mean, that is now understanding how the free trade agreement they signed with Uruguay in 2016 impacts women and allowed women, I don't remember the figures exactly, but they're quite substantial figures, to export, to allowing them to export these gender provisions they negotiated with Uruguay. So only now they are able to understand this impact. Another thing which is very difficult to know about the impact is that often all of these policies, whether FTAs, national or aid for trade, they don't have a mechanism where you monitor or evaluate your activities. So you say, okay, we're going to do a capacity building program. We have money only for a year, and then we don't have the resources anymore. And then 6 months later, you have resources, so you do another one. And so this kind of ad hoc way of implementing your policies doesn't really help you also. And if you don't have the mechanism to understand, okay, it's not about how many women we've trained, but how women have used the training to be able, in terms of entrepreneurs, to be able to export. How many have gone, have gone international, how many have remained at the domestic level, because some of them are saying, it's too much for me, I can't do it. It's very difficult. Trade is difficult. Trade is super costly. So you need to have access to finance. And this is where we go back to what you were saying in terms of you need to have all these different perspectives. Often when I talk, and one last point if I may, when I talk about access to finance, people are saying to me, but it's not a trade issue. Well, it is very much a trade issue. If you're an entrepreneur, you don't have access to finance. You cannot cover the cost of trade. You can't get your certification. You cannot have proper labeling, proper packaging, so that your product really fits the technical requirements in the export market, and so on and so forth. You have tons of costs that you need to cover. So basically, you need also to integrate all these different perspectives to understand how your policy is impactful or not. And we have some examples of how it works. One example, as I said, was Chile, but we don't have enough. We don't have enough because we don't know also about these implementation processes at the national level. It's quite difficult. At the WTO, we have a trade policy review mechanism where members report back to the organization about their trade policies and how they've implemented it. I've been struggling for the last 8 years to work with governments, even those that are open to it, to have a proper chapter or at least a good section about what they're doing on trade and gender. I know they're doing things, but they don't report it to the WTO. So there is also some internal mechanism that prevents that, but it could take another hour to talk about that. So you have all these different pieces of the puzzle that would need to be sort of put together, so that you would need to be having this sort of real impact on the ground. And I think that the examples that we have right now, they are not sufficient. But still, we definitely know that it can definitely help women. I'm super convinced of that. If only it's that.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. So will you join with me again in thanking Anoush for her insights?